CountryWide CONNECT with Andy Thompson and Sarah Perriam-Lampp.
Hi there and welcome to this week's episode of Dairy Country. I'm here with Ginny Dodunski and it's always wonderful to talk to Ginny. Hi, Ginny.
Good morning. Good morning. It's nice to be here again. Like being able to speak to dairy farmers.
It's so good to have you. Ginny is the program manager for WormWise, and hopefully most people know that by now because you have done an awesome job, Ginny, at getting out there in front of the public and talking to farmers about this issue. You've been a veterinarian now for almost 30 years, so you've seen it all. You've seen lots of things on farm and also understand really the practical aspects of managing young animals as they get older. And for our dairy stock, I guess it's our young animals that we think of as those that could be or are susceptible to a worm burden. One of the big things that everybody is facing right now, though, is drench resistance. It's a very frightening situation that our sheep cousins have been dealing with for some time. Can you fill us in on what drench resistance is to start with, and we'll kick it off from there and talk a bit more about what farmers can do about it.
Great, thanks, Anne. So, yeah, just to get people in the picture, when we're talking about drench resistance, it means you've got worms on your farm that have got the genetics to survive the worm or anthelmintic treatments that you're treating your livestock with. And way back at the dawn of time, when the first white drench was released, which was back in the 60s, there were worms around then that for whatever reason had a combination of genes that enabled them to survive that product, but it took a very, very long time, over the decades to kind of breed them up to a point where we could actually find them when we test on farm. And we've been using combination anthelmintics mostly in New Zealand now for probably a couple of decades. Unfortunately, by the time we started using those, there was quite a high level of background resistance to the individual drugs in those combinations. So on a lot of farms, without kind of management change and practice change, as well as using combinations, all we've really done is hasten the development of combination resistant worms, which is what, some of this data that we might talk about in a minute is now highlighting. But just to clarify for farmers what we mean when we talk about drench resistance, it can be anything from the disasters that we've seen in lamb systems and in some intensive calf systems already, where you've actually got sick and dying animals because they've got so many worms that are not surviving the drench, or it can be as subtle as having done a drench test where you administer the anthelmintic, you do some sampling on that day, and then you do some sampling 10 or 14 days later, and then you can calculate by how much that treatment reduced the worm burden in the animals. That can be quite subtle. It may be just that it's not reducing the worm burden as measured by egg count by 100%, and it's only dropping it by, say, 90% or 85%. So that's still classed as resistance. If the egg count isn't being reduced by 95% after treatment, then that's called resistance, but you won't see that with your eyes until your products are probably almost down near the 50% mark. And you don't want to be there, because when you get to that point, then you've got a huge level of resistant worm contamination on your farm, and it's a big, big hill to climb back up out of there. So that's why we're encouraging cattle farmers in particular to start doing some testing and find where they are on that slope, because it's much easier to wind your way back out of it when you've only got a small hill to climb, as opposed to, digging yourself out of that hole where the drenches are already 50% or less effective. So that's the whole message at the moment to cattle farmers is to find out where you are, and then make a plan from there.
Right. So going back to some of the research, we had an article in our Autumn Dairy Country magazine, and I'd say to people, listeners who want to have a look at that, there's some more detail in there too. But And there's also some fantastic data and detail and information on the WormWise website. So have a look at that. We'll link that in our show notes so people can kind of dig into that. But tell us a little bit about some of this research that was done that was quite foreboding in terms of Couperia resistance in calves.
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify again for people, there's two main worms that affect our cattle. Couperia, which is a small intestinal one. It sort of grazes away on the lining of the small intestine and causes damage when it's in large numbers. And then we've got Ostatagia, which is a more nasty one. It lives in the fourth stomach or the abomasum. It actually burrows into the stomach lining and can cause quite substantial damage and be more of an issue in older cattle. So the canary in the mine has kind of been this Couperia worm. We've had resistance in that worm for a very long time. 20 plus years, farmers will mostly know that they need to use a drench that has levamisole in it because the Mectin family of drench, which has been the other mainstay of the common products that are used in cattle, Couperia in New Zealand have mostly been resistant to that Mectin drench for at least 20 years, and we've been relying very heavily on levamisole. But what this stuff that we've managed to collate together has highlighted is now that we have significant levels of resistance in Couperia to that levamisole product that we've been relying on, to the combination drenches that contain levamisole. The idea that you can just walk into your farm store or your vets and as long as you're picking up a combination drench, she'll be right. This data would indicate that that is no longer the case. So this data goes back to testing that probably started in about 2021. And there's been 3 reports, one from Ag Research, one from my mate Garth Riddell, who's a cattle vet up in Northland, and then one that we collated through WormWise, going out to vets and asking them for all their drench testing information. The findings are very, very similar, and there is quite a bit of overlap between those cases that are reported because there's actually been very little formal testing reported through the laboratories or published in New Zealand. For instance, the WormWise data, that's only 16 farms. Like, the stuff for sheep, there's like 160 or 190 or something tests published annually in the last few years for sheep. We've got, I think, 59 total tests and only 16 farms. So I do admit that it is a very limited data set. And it is biased towards intensive young cattle properties. So that's bull beef and dairy heifer properties. They are, so because they're more risky, right? You've only often got 1 or 2 classes of cattle, i.e. R1s and R2s, which are the big worm polluters on the farm as well. So it's not surprising that these resistance problems have jumped to the fore in these systems, but that just highlights the need to do something a bit different in these systems to reduce the total reliance on drench for managing worms.
What did you find in those surveys?
Yeah, so what we found, unfortunately, was that a very high percentage of the farms have got Couperia that are surviving levamisole and surviving combinations. At an undifferentiated level, like resistance in any worm species to any of the drugs. Of the survey that we did, 59 tests, 41 of those tests have resistance in either Ostatagia or Couperia. When we drill down to the farms, 13 of the 16 farms have got resistance in either Ostatagia or Couperia to one or more combinations. Then if we look at it at the product level, in the WormWise data set, there were 11 tests of an oral triple combination, which most farmers would think is the gold standard. Farmers don't like being told that they have to use an oral drench. There's good reasons for that. I can go into that if you want to. But, of 11 tests of this drug, 5 of those farms had resistant Ostatagia and 6 of them had resistant Couperia. That's to a triple. So that you are getting to the end of the highway with drug choices when you've got that going on. There's really only one other drug that you've got in your toolbox at that point. So you really have to start making some changes. And of those very common popular products that dairy farmers use, the Mectin levamisole combinations, I'm not going to name products on the air, but they're pour-ons, they're injections. You quite often get a free shirt or free chainsaw or something with them. But they're a mixture of the old mectin drugs, which is abamectin, aprinomectin, doramectin, moxidectin, anything with an ectin on the end. It's all the same family. They're not actually different in terms of how resistance is inherited in the worms. So they're a mix of mectin and levamisole, which we've already talked about. 19 tests of that drug or that drug combination, either as pour-ons, orals, or injectables. 12 of those 19 tests had resistant Couperia, and 4 of them had, more worryingly, resistant Osteotargia. The thing about Osteotargia, though, is it's often in calves present at quite a low level at the time where you might be testing. And so quite a proportion of those tests didn't actually have enough Osteotargia there to properly highlight whether or not resistance was present. So that 4 out of 19 is probably quite a big underestimate of the resistant Osteotargia. And when you go back to the triple results, where you had 11 tests and 5 of them, like nearly half, had resistant Osteotargia, it is more than likely that that double combination is an underrepresentation of it. So yeah, to think that drench resistance isn't an issue in cattle, right, and we can just keep doing whatever we like, these data would suggest that that is not the case, and they are just the tip of the iceberg. So yeah, do some testing.
CountryWide Connect with Andy Thompson and Sarah Perriam-Lampp.